Very good day, my dear students. In this video, I am going to provide you some guidance on a very important point. And this is the point relating to the right approach or the correct approach that you must follow in solving questions in the income tax paper where you are asked to compute the tax liability of the SSE. So you are asked to compute the tax liability of the SSE, and then you need to read the question and check the wording of the question, because the question may ask you to exactly compute the tax liability in a particular fashion or in a particular manner. Why I'm making this video is because I have noticed many a times that for maybe multiple reasons, the students are not able to correctly figure out what is to be done in the question. So either they are in a hurry, or they are tensed, or they are confused, or there is lack of clarity in terms of concepts, etc. And because of one or more reasons, the students misconstrue what is exactly asked in the question, and so they solve the question incorrectly. They solve it in a manner which has not been asked in the first place. So they think they are right and they come back happy, but later on they realize that, oh, I did not read the question properly, and therefore everything has gone for a toss, and I have lost so many marks because of careless omission and careless mistake on my part. And there is something that ICAI examiners have also pointed out in the past regarding this issue. So I thought it will be very useful for you if I make a short video guiding you on the approach which you should follow depending on the language, the exact wordings used in the question, where the question is asking you to make computation of tax liability of the SSE. Now, before I do that, I would just like to recap a few basics, which I'm sure you are already aware of, but it will be useful to recap the basics right away. So when we are talking about computation of tax liability, you know that the computation can be made as per two tax regimes which are applicable under the Income Tax Act. The default tax regime is covered under section 115 BAC, and this is something that we call as the default tax regime, under which concessional rates of tax are applicable provided the SSE foregoes certain specified exemptions and deductions. So this is the default. Okay. Now you know that the SSE can move out or opt out of the default tax regime, in which case what becomes applicable is the optional tax regime. And in such case, the computation of tax liability, the total income and the tax liability has to be made as per the optional tax regime. There is also an angle regarding AMT. AMT, or alternate minimum tax. Alternate minimum tax is by the wordings, it's clear that it's the minimum amount of tax which the SSE is required to pay if otherwise the normal or the regular tax liability is below the AMT. In such case, AMT becomes payable because that is the minimum amount the government wants the SSE to pay. And there are certain conditions that need to be satisfied for AMT provisions to apply. Now, what we know is if the default tax regime is applicable, then AMT provisions do not apply. AMT provisions apply when the optional tax regime is applicable. So when you are making computation of tax liability under the optional tax regime, you must also consider and apply the provisions of AMT if the applicability conditions of AMT are getting satisfied. Okay, this is clear. So when you are computing tax liability, you either compute it as per the default tax regime 115 BAC or the optional tax regime. If you are computing under the optional tax regime, you must consider the provisions of AMT as well. Okay, so this was a quick recap, and now we move to the note that I have, which you are seeing on your screen, and there are basically 6 categories which demonstrate the different kind of language which you will find in the question in the exam paper, and depending on the exact wordings of the question, you will need to make the computation of tax liability and solve the question. So let's move one by one. So the question may, okay, so this table has a column where I mentioned what is asked in the exam question, what could be the language or the wording of the question, and then I'll tell you what to consider while making computation of tax liability and what you should ignore while computing tax liability. Okay, so let's move to number 1. And in this case, what the question may state is compute tax liability under the default tax regime under section 115 BAC, full stop. That's it. The question is very clear. There is no confusion. And therefore, what you should do, you should make the computation of total income and tax liability only under the default tax regime under section 115 BAC. The total income as well as the tax liability, simply make computation under the default tax regime under section 115 BAC, and consequently what you need to ignore, the optional tax regime as well as AMT provisions. You should not apply the optional tax regime. Also, you should not apply AMT provisions because AMT provisions are not applicable if the computation is being made under the default tax regime under section 115 BAC. Is this clear? Now we move to second kind of question which may be asked, and in this case the question may ask you to compute tax liability under the optional tax regime, or alternatively the question may state that the SSE has opted out of section 115 BAC. It means one and the same thing. It means one and the same thing. In both these situations of the wordings of the question, you should make the computation of total income and tax liability under the optional tax regime. And remember, when you are making the computation under optional tax regime, you should also consider AMT if the conditions are satisfied, if AMT provisions apply. Okay, why? Because you are simply asked to compute tax liability under the optional tax regime, and therefore by default, by implication, you are also required to consider AMT provisions. For example, if the SSE has claim deduction under section 10AA or 35 AD, right, or 80 QQB or 80 RRB, these are the sections you would know under which AMT becomes applicable. Okay, and therefore, if you find such kind of fact pattern in the question, then you should automatically, even if the question has not asked you to specifically consider AMT, you should consider AMT because you are making the computation under the optional tax regime. No confusion? What this means is that you should not make any computation under the default tax regime. Simply optional tax regime and then consider AMT provisions if they are applicable. Now, in a third case, in a third scenario, the question may ask you to compute tax liability under the optional tax regime. But now here, the question may specifically ask you to ignore the provisions of AMT. Okay, so what you will do? This is also very simple and easy to understand, that you should make the computation of total income and tax liability only under the optional tax regime, even if you find that the AMT provisions are applicable because specified deductions have been claimed by the SSE. Even then you should not apply AMT because the question has specifically asked you to ignore the provisions of AMT. So what you need to ignore is AMT provisions because the question has asked you to ignore. And since the question has asked you to compute only under the optional tax regime, you should ignore the default tax regime under section 115 BAC. Is this clear? Next, number 4. In number 4, the question will ask you to compute tax liability in the manner most beneficial to the SSE. And the question will specifically ask you to ignore the provisions of AMT. Now, when the question is asking you to compute in the manner most beneficial to the SSE, the question is not exactly or specifically referring to either the default tax regime or the optional tax regime. It is not referring particularly to any tax regime. So what do you need to do? You need to make the computation both under the default and optional tax regime. And then you need to compare to figure out what is most beneficial to the SSE. So you compute total income under the default tax regime, total income under the optional tax regime without applying the AMT provisions, even if they are applicable, because the question is specifically asking you to ignore AMT. And then you compute tax liability under the default tax regime and tax liability under the optional tax regime. And then you should compare the result and then determine which is more beneficial to the SSE, and that will be your answer. Okay. So what this means is you need to ignore AMT provisions. Number 5. In number 5, the question will ask you to compute tax liability in the manner most beneficial to the assessee. So no specific reference to any tax regime, just as you saw in number 4. But the difference in number 4 and number 5 is in number 4, you were specifically asked to ignore the provisions of AMT. In number 5, there is no mention of AMT. So there is no mention of AMT, there is no mention of any specific tax regime. So what this means is that you need to apply all the applicable provisions and then figure out what is the position which is most beneficial to the assessee. What this means is that you should make the computation both under the default and optional tax regime and then compare. Also, you should consider AMT if applicable under the optional tax regime. So what you will do is you will compute total income under the default tax regime. Okay. And then you will compute tax liability under the default tax regime. Then on the other hand, you will make computation under the optional tax regime. And while doing so, you will again make computation in 2 parts. Under the optional tax regime, you will first make the computation without applying AMT. And in the second part, you will make the computation after applying AMT. And then you will figure out whether AMT is applicable or not. Right? And then you will compare your computation under the default tax regime and the optional tax regime and figure out which is more beneficial. So under the default tax regime, you will have an answer. Okay. Under the optional tax regime, if AMT provision is not applicable at all in the first place, then you will simply make computation under the optional tax regime, compute tax liability, and then you will compare tax liability under default and optional tax regime and figure out which is more beneficial to the assessee. If you find out that AMT provisions are applicable, then you will apply AMT provisions and then you will figure out whether the AMT is payable or whether the regular or the normal tax as per the optional tax regime is payable. Whatever is payable, that will become the tax liability under the optional tax regime. And consequently, you will then finally compare the tax liability under default tax regime and under the optional tax regime, and that will give you the answer. So what do you need to ignore in such case? Nothing. So you need to apply all the applicable provisions. So you will need to check the wording of the question, the fact pattern, and then determine whether AMT applies or not, and then accordingly make the whole computation. And then finally compare and arrive at your answer. In number 6, the question may simply state compute tax liability of the assessee. The question is not even mentioning that compute tax liability in the manner most beneficial to the assessee. In number 5, it was in the manner most beneficial to the assessee. In number 6, you may just see compute tax liability. But in this case, let me tell you that your approach will be exactly the same as in number 5. Because whether or not the question specifically mentions you to compute tax liability in the manner most beneficial to the assessee, it is understood that you need to make the computation in the manner most beneficial to the assessee, even if it is not specifically so mentioned in the question. So if it is given that compute tax liability, you need to make computation under both the tax regimes and then make a comparison, and whatever is more beneficial to the assessee, that will be your answer, and you will need to support your answer with the appropriate note that this is more beneficial to the assessee. Okay, so basically number 5 and 6 approach is the same. So I hope this is absolutely clear to you, and my request to you, my humble request to you will be, don't panic, don't get tensed, don't be in a hurry. Okay, because what happens, you lose out. Okay, this damages your ability of the mind to exercise patience, concentration, and attention, which is very much detrimental, because then you don't read the question carefully, you hurry. Okay, you skip the words, something is written in the question, you are not able to see, or even if you are able to see, you are in such a hurry, you are in so much of panic and tension that you fail to understand what exactly is being asked of me, and then you solve the question incorrectly. So what's the point? Okay, so it's very important that you read every word of every question very carefully, with full attention and concentration. Even if you devote a minute extra reading the question with patience, it will pay you in the end. You will not lose out on marks because of silly mistakes. So this is all in this video. In the next video, what I'm going to do is, see this number 5 and 6, computation of tax liability, where you need to make computation under both the tax regimes and then compare. I will make a video on how to solve such kind of questions where you are required to apply all kinds of provisions and then make a comparison where both basically where uh, the default tax regime as well as the optional tax regime and the AMT provisions are applicable. I will make a video on what is the approach that you should follow in solving such kind of questions. So see you in my next video. All the best to you. Very good luck to you. See you and goodbye. Good luck.